As my heir, William now assumes the Scottish titles which have meant so much to me. He succeeds me as Duke of Rothesay. King Charles did not summon the nation, stand before the cameras, or deliver a grand royal address. Instead, behind a closed door at Windsor, he lifted a black fountain pen and signed a document so sensitive that only 3 sealed copies were permitted to exist. Its subject was Prince William's coronation, and the decision written inside it would permanently alter the future of the British crown. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Charles entered his private study at night carrying his decision. His constitutional secretary waited beside the keeper of the Privy Seal, the official who guards the monarch's most sensitive state documents. The doors were locked. A red dispatch box rested unopened between them. The king broke the seal. Inside lay a succession instrument, a binding royal order, beginning preparations for William's coronation while Charles remained alive and sovereign. It did not remove the monarch or force immediate abdication. Instead, it fixed a ceremonial date window, granted the prince authority over his crowning, and blocked palace factions from delaying the transition. When Charles relinquished the crown, Charles reached the page bearing William's name and stopped. His fingers tightened around the pen because this was no longer procedure. A father was admitting that his son's hour had arrived, while part of him still struggled to accept what that meant for his reign. Camilla learned of the meeting only after the final seal had been pressed into place. She stood outside the study as an aide confirmed that the queen consort had not been consulted. Her face hardened. The decision would shape her position and influence, yet the door had closed before she could speak. The most dangerous clauses remained hidden. One ordered a ceremony built around service, restraint, and the memory of Diana, Princess of Wales. Another barred anyone outside the direct line of succession from controlling the Coronation Council, the body assigned to plan the ceremony. Camilla's authority was suddenly uncertain, while courtiers expecting influence had been pushed aside before the battle began. Charles signed the final page, placed the pen beside the red box, and said quietly, "There must be no confusion when the hour comes." The secretary sealed the document before anyone spoke. Before dawn, a private messenger was ordered to carry one copy directly to William, who had no idea his father had designed the beginning of his reign. And when that sealed envelope finally reached William, the shock was not simply that his coronation had been planned. It was what his father expected him to surrender before he could wear the crown. For the public, a coronation is a spectacle of gold, vows, and ancient ceremony. For Prince William, the sealed document was something far more painful. Proof that his father had begun preparing for an ending neither man had spoken aloud. As he read the first page beside Catherine, the future king discovered that the crown was moving toward him faster than duty, family, or grief had allowed him to admit. William received the envelope at Adelaide Cottage before breakfast. The courier asked for his signature, watched until the sealed copy rested firmly in his hands, and departed without offering a single explanation. The prince carried it inside with growing unease, because private royal deliveries did not arrive without purpose, and this one bore the weight of a decision already made. William broke the seal beside Catherine and read the opening clause twice. A coronation framework was the official plan governing the ceremony, its advisors, and the transfer of responsibilities surrounding a future sovereign. Accepting it would move him beyond the role of supportive heir. He would become an active sovereign in waiting while Charles still occupied the throne, carrying new authority before either father or son had publicly acknowledged the change. Catherine watched confusion leave her husband's face and disbelief take its place. She felt pride in the man he had become. Yet fear rose just as quickly. William's elevation would also pull George closer to the crown, placing the young prince beneath the same pressure his father had carried after Diana's death. Success for one generation could become suffering for the next. Catherine reached across the table and placed her hand over the pages. "Did Charles warn you?" she asked. William looked toward the window before answering, not with words. The reply exposed years of emotional distance between the king and the son, expected to continue his reign. William turned another page and discovered that Charles had named him joint supervisor of all coronation planning. The power allowed the future king to reject traditions, appointments, and ceremonial roles before any transition occurred. Then came the sharper blow. He had 72 hours to provide written acceptance. Silence would not delay the process. Silence would count as consent, meaning his father had deliberately closed every path of avoidance. Camilla received her notification at Clarence's house soon afterward. She read the 2-line message beside an untouched tea tray, folded the paper once, and asked why William had been informed before her. The Queen Consort read it again, but no second explanation arrived. William remained at the table, questioning why Charles had acted with such urgency. He did not yet know that one humiliating incident months earlier had convinced the monarch that succession could no longer remain an unwritten understanding. The answer lay not in the sealed document itself, but in a ceremony where one unexpected interruption exposed how dangerously divided the palace had already become. The secret coronation order did not begin with a lawyer, a medical warning, or a constitutional debate. It began during a ceremony that should have displayed royal unity before senior courtiers and invited dignitaries. A simple change to William's position triggered a confrontation so public, so humiliating, and so revealing that Charles later called it the moment he understood the crown could fracture before it ever reached his son. 6 months earlier, Charles entered the planning chamber at Windsor expecting order. Senior relatives and court officials had gathered to approve the procession, seating, and ceremonial precedents for the royal year ahead. The Order of the Garter ceremony, an ancient gathering honoring the monarchy's highest order of chivalry, depended on position because every place silently announced rank, trust, and authority. William had been instructed to sit beside his father. The change appeared small, yet everyone understood its meaning. The prince was no longer being treated only as the dutiful heir waiting behind the king. He was being shown as the man already preparing to carry more of the monarch's burden. William entered and stopped. His chair had been moved away from Charles, while Camilla's place had been restored directly beside the sovereign. A senior court official had made the alteration after a private discussion with the Queen Consort's household, but no approval had come from the king. William refused to sit. He said nothing, yet his stillness exposed the insult more clearly than anger could have done. The future king remained standing as courtiers glanced toward one another, understanding that the rearrangement was deliberate and that everyone present had been forced to witness it. Charles demanded to know who authorized the change. Camilla answered that it was only a matter of ceremonial balance. She insisted that her place beside her husband protected continuity, but the monarch heard a deeper message beneath her words. William's growing authority was being challenged before it had even been formally defined. Charles gripped the back of his son's displaced chair. He dragged it across the floor himself and placed it beside his own. The harsh sound silenced the chamber. Camilla watched without moving while William finally sat, not in triumph, but with the cold restraint of someone who knew the conflict had only begun. Charles received a documented briefing that evening, revealing draft succession plans circulating between rival households. The papers proposed competing roles, titles, and powers after his reign. Without a signed framework, William's accession could be delayed, manipulated, or privately negotiated at the moment Britain needed certainty most. Charles sat alone afterward, studying a photograph of himself with his son. He admitted to his private secretary that he had waited too long to define the future. The chair had exposed more than wounded pride. It had revealed a monarchy already dividing around a crown that had not yet changed hands. William would soon learn exactly what happened, and his response would be immediate. That meeting would not be conducted through secretaries or ceremonial language, because William entered Windsor determined to ask his father the one question Charles had hoped to avoid. William arrived at Windsor carrying the signed document in his own hand. He refused the waiting equerry, passed the private secretary without stopping, and entered his father's study alone. Charles was standing beside the window when the door closed. There were no advisors, no constitutional experts, and no prepared statements. Only a father who had made an irreversible decision and a son demanding to know whether love or fear had driven it. William had requested the private audience within minutes of finishing the document. Charles cleared the room, dismissed every member of staff, and ordered that no one interrupt them. The prince placed the succession instrument on the desk. It was a binding royal order controlling the practical path toward the next reign, and he understood its force. What he did not understand was why his father had acted so quickly, or why secrecy had mattered more than trust. William looked directly at him. "Are you preparing to leave or pushing me forward because you no longer trust the people around you?" The question struck deeper than either man expected. Charles stiffened because both possibilities carried truth. He had begun planning for an ending, and he had lost faith in those already circling his son's future. Charles accused him of treating preparation as betrayal. William answered that a coronation was not an administrative handover. It would change Catherine's life, reshape George's future, and touch every private relationship he still possessed. The future king had spent years learning how duty could consume a family. He would not pretend that another crown could arrive without another cost. Charles pulled a chair toward him, but William remained standing. The king removed his glasses and placed them on top of the document. Then he admitted that palace households had already begun fighting over his son's reign before the heir had been allowed to control it. Charles spoke more quietly. He feared hesitation would leave William surrounded by factions at the most vulnerable moment of his life. His voice broke when he said he refused to let his son inherit confusion alongside the crown. The confession did not erase the secrecy, but it changed its meaning. William opened the document again and found powers he had not fully understood. He could dismantle the existing coronation committee, the group responsible for planning the crowning ceremony, and appoint advisors of his own choosing. Several long-serving courtiers would lose the influence they had expected. Charles then admitted he signed before Camilla could challenge the restrictions placed on non-heirs. The queen consort had been excluded because secrecy was not merely procedure. It was protection against resistance already forming inside the palace. William did not reject the order. He demanded one condition instead. Catherine must be included in every decision affecting their children. Charles agreed, but warned that his signature was only part of the structure. And behind the king's dramatic signature stood a strategist whose loyalty was not to Charles, Camilla, or even William personally, but to the survival of the crown itself. The nation would eventually see Charles's signature and William's reaction, but neither man had constructed the path alone. For weeks, Princess Anne had moved between Windsor, Buckingham Palace, and the ancient offices guarding the crown's ceremonial authority. She asked no public questions and made no dramatic declarations. Yet every clause limiting interference, every safeguard protecting William, and every deadline forcing action carried the unmistakable discipline of the Princess Royal. Anne had been asked privately by Charles to answer one dangerous question. Could preparations for a future coronation begin before abdication without creating a rival court around William? A rival court meant a second center of royal power forming around an heir, while the reigning monarch still ruled, and that risk could divide loyalties before any transition occurred. Her task was precise. Keep the king sovereign, give the prince enough operational authority to prepare, and stop competing households from exploiting uncertainty. Anne sat alone in a records room, comparing different drafts of the ceremony. Her anger surfaced when she found provisions allowing ceremonial advisors to overrule William on decisions involving Catherine and George. The future king's wife and son were not side issues. Their roles would shape public trust, family stability, and the emotional tone of the next reign. Anne felt the strain immediately. Loyalty to Charles demanded discretion, but responsibility to her nephew demanded protection. She knew the secrecy could wound William, yet delay would leave him exposed to courtiers already planning how to preserve their own influence. Camilla confronted her in a private corridor before the final papers were sealed. The queen consort asked whether she had helped exclude the queen's household from the process. Anne answered that no spouse should control the next sovereign's coronation regardless of history, rank, or personal sacrifice. Camilla stepped closer. "You have written me out." Anne closed the file in her hands. "No. I stopped anyone from writing themselves in." Anne had already secured written agreement from the Archbishop's office, senior constitutional advisors, and the coronation authorities. The Archbishop's office represented the church officials responsible for the sacred parts of the crowning ceremony, while the coronation authorities managed its legal and ceremonial structure. Their support made Charles's framework difficult to reverse once his signature was added. Anne inserted one final condition herself. William's coronation oath would include a personal promise of transparency, restraint, and service. The oath was the solemn pledge made by a monarch during the ceremony, and her wording was a direct answer to the rivalry that had forced the document into existence. William now understood why his aunt mattered. She held the knowledge needed to activate the entire plan, making her the bridge between his father's reign and his own. But once the palace discovered how much power had shifted, loyalty began turning into panic. By the following morning, offices were being reassigned, names were disappearing from confidential lists, and the queen finally understood what the document had taken from her. The secret document remained hidden from the country, but inside the palace its force was immediate. Doors that had always opened without question now required written authorization. Advisors who expected years of influence found their names missing from the new coronation structure. And in the queen's private sitting room, Camilla received a formal notice confirming that William, not Charles's household, would decide who stood closest to the throne on Coronation Day. William moved quickly. He suspended the existing coronation planning group and ordered a full review of its members, finances, ceremonial assumptions, and private communications. The planning group was the body responsible for preparing the future crowning ceremony, and controlling it meant controlling who would shape the opening image of the next reign. Catherine was added to the supervisory council, while Anne became transition chair, creating a new center of authority around the direct line of succession. Camilla read the notice alone. She removed her glasses and remained motionless while an aide waited for instructions. Then she asked whether Charles had approved the wording. The answer came quietly. The king had signed it himself. Camilla felt more than exclusion. She felt judged. Years of public service, loyalty, and sacrifice had been reduced to a fear that she might interfere with William's future. The queen consort read the notice again, but the words did not soften. Charles visited her later. He could not promise to restore her influence because the framework had been designed to protect his son from competing households. Camilla listened, then answered with controlled pain. "You protected William by humiliating your wife." Camilla slid the notice across the table toward him. Charles did not pick it up. The monarch kept his hands still as silence widened between them. She finally turned the document face down, and that small gesture changed the argument. This was no longer only about ceremony. It had entered their marriage. Anne uncovered the reason for the urgency soon afterward. A documented review of private messages showed several courtiers discussing how to preserve their positions after Charles's reign. The Princess Royal removed their names from confidential lists, proving that the king's fears had not been imagined. William then discovered something worse. One proposed arrangement would have delayed Catherine's full ceremonial recognition while expanding Camilla's advisory role during the first year of his reign. The future king understood that informal promises had already become tools of pressure. William ordered every transition decision to be recorded in writing. No whispered agreement, private assurance, or household understanding would survive without proof. The old palace culture had ended in a single command, yet victory brought no peace. William remained disturbed by what the decision had done to his father and Camilla. Late that night, he asked Charles to meet him somewhere without files, officials, or royal offices between them. Away from the red boxes and guarded corridors, father and son would finally confront not how the crown should pass, but what they still meant to each other before it did. There was no throne room, no secretary taking notes, and no document waiting for another signature. Charles and William met in a small private room at Highgrove after midnight, each arriving without an aide. For the first time since the order was signed, they spoke not as sovereign and heir, but as two men shaped by duty, loss, and years of conversations postponed until the crown made honesty unavoidable. William had chosen Highgrove because it belonged emotionally to his father, not institutionally to the monarchy. The house carried Charles's private memories, far from the pressure of Windsor and the machinery surrounding the crown. Both men agreed that the signed order would remain in force, but the prince insisted they understand its meaning before the nation was asked to accept it. Charles poured the tea himself. His hand shook slightly, and a few drops spilled onto the saucer. He looked down, laughed once at his own unsteadiness, and the sound broke the tension more effectively than any prepared apology could have done. William admitted that he had first read the document as a loss of faith. He believed his father no longer trusted him to choose when he was ready. Charles answered with painful honesty. The king had feared asking openly because his son might refuse out of loyalty, placing love above preparation and leaving the future exposed again. Charles leaned forward and told him the order was not meant to replace him. It was meant to ensure that William would never inherit the uncertainty he himself had carried to the throne. The monarch had expressed protection through the only language he had trusted all his life: duty. William finally understood. The secrecy had wounded him, but the purpose behind it was not rejection. His father had tried to secure the road ahead before fear, rivalry, and grief could block it. William reached into his coat and placed his signed acceptance beside Charles's teacup. The acceptance was his formal written agreement to carry out the coronation framework when the time came. "I will do it, but we do it honestly," he said. The king rested one hand on the page without looking down. William then revealed his first decision. The ceremony would honor Charles's service, while openly recognizing Diana's influence on the man who would one day be crowned. The future king would not erase either parent to protect the other. William also asked his father to remain publicly beside him throughout the preparation period. Their unity would prevent the transition from appearing like rejection, defeat, or an internal overthrow. Charles agreed to announce the framework himself. Secrecy had protected the order, but continued silence would now damage the crown. By morning, the palace was preparing the statement, unaware of how violently the words "coronation" would spread across Britain. What began as a signature in silence was about to become a national reckoning, and one unforgettable image would define how the country understood it. At 6 in the morning, the palace released a statement unlike anything Britain had expected. King Charles had authorized formal preparations for Prince William's future coronation, and granted his heir immediate control over the ceremony. Within minutes, broadcasters abandoned their schedules, newspaper presses restarted, and crowds began forming outside royal gates. The secret was no longer a family burden. It had become a national moment of judgment. Buckingham Palace confirmed that the signed document prepared the path toward William's crowning, while Charles remained on the throne. Abdication meant a monarch formally giving up the crown, and the statement stressed that no such act had occurred. The king was still sovereign. The prince was simply being given authority to shape the ceremony before the moment arrived. The announcement called the decision planned continuity, not crisis. Yet its timing made that language difficult to control. Britain had never been asked to watch one reign openly prepare the ceremony of the next, and speculation spread immediately about whether unity had survived inside the palace. A special morning edition reached Victoria Station with a striking front page. Charles appeared beside the headline, "The Crown Prepares for William." Commuters gathered around the newspaper stand, reading in stunned silence as phones began ringing and strangers quietly repeated the same question. Why now? A national broadcaster described it as the first coronation planned by a reigning monarch for his own successor. The sentence moved across television, radio, and online coverage, turning a private act of preparation into a phrase the entire country could understand. William watched the report with Catherine and their children. George noticed his father's photograph beside a crown and asked whether everything would now change. The prince hesitated. Catherine answered first, telling their son that the family would remain together, even as she exchanged a worried glance with her husband. National excitement had entered their home as a private burden. Crowds gathered outside Buckingham Palace by mid-morning. Some cheered William's readiness. Others held photographs of Charles and applauded the monarch for defining the succession before uncertainty could divide the country. Support for the son did not erase loyalty to the father. For many, both emotions existed at once. The palace then released one controlled detail. William would redesign the coronation around public service, modern representation, and reduced royal excess. The ceremony would still be sacred, but it would speak to a nation demanding restraint. Camilla appeared beside Charles during a brief public departure. She ignored shouted questions and kept her composure. The queen consort's silence suggested acceptance, yet the new hierarchy was unmistakable. Now the king and his heir had to stand together and explain whether the document represented decline, division, or renewal. Their final appearance would settle that question, transforming a secret born from fear into a public statement about what the crown had chosen to become. When Charles and William finally stood together, there was no announcement of defeat, no forced farewell, and no struggle for possession of the throne. The king spoke first, acknowledging that monarchy survives only when duty is prepared before crisis demands it. Then William stepped forward, not as a son replacing his father, but as an heir publicly accepting the burden his father had chosen to place in trusted hands. Charles confirmed that he would continue serving as sovereign, while William led the coronation preparations and assumed wider responsibilities across the monarchy. A sovereign was the reigning ruler who still held the crown's full constitutional authority, and that distinction mattered. The father was not being removed. The son was being prepared with clarity before uncertainty could return. Charles explained through the formal address that the secret document had been created to protect constitutional continuity, the stable and lawful passage of royal authority from one reign to the next. It would prevent private competition, silence rival households, and ensure that William inherited a defined structure rather than a palace already fighting over his future. Charles then lifted the original sealed copy and handed it to William before the cameras. The prince accepted it with both hands, turned toward his father, and bowed. The gesture honored the sovereign, but it also honored the man whose painful decision had made the transition possible. William thanked him publicly for choosing preparation over pride. His words ended the belief that the document had been designed to reject Charles or force him aside. The future king made the truth unmistakable. His father had not weakened the monarchy by planning ahead. He had strengthened it. Catherine stood beside William as an equal partner in the new framework. George watched nearby, seeing succession presented not as sudden loss, but as responsible preparation. The princess understood that her husband's rise would change their family, yet she also knew secrecy had finally given way to trust. Camilla accepted that she would not control William's coronation or shape his future court. The queen consort still carried the pain of exclusion, but she chose not to challenge the signed order. Her restraint ended the internal struggle and preserved the dignity that open resistance would have destroyed. Anne stepped away from the transition chair once the structure was secure. The Princess Royal had never sought personal power. She had protected the transfer of authority, blocked those trying to exploit it, and returned control to the rightful heir. William's signed acceptance was placed beside Charles's signature in the royal archive, turning the order from a father's command into a shared promise between two generations. The secret signature had stunned the nation, but its final meaning was unmistakable. Charles had not surrendered the crown. He had secured its future by entrusting it with open eyes to his son. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next video.